Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Costola. Welcome to the Dissenter Weekly Update for August 13th, 2020. Before we get rolling, I would just like to take a moment to let you know that I have a guest today. This is, if I can do the camera right, this is my cat, and this is Bogart. And I'm only doing this because I guarantee that at some point during this broadcast, we are going to have to pause or maybe turn away from the show just a moment so that I can let him do whatever, because he's a cat. And you can control a dog, but I don't think you can control a cat.
Oh, so, I don't know about that. I don't know if you can control a dog, but I hear you.
Oh, and here he comes, making his way to the camera. Let's sit down. Let's do a show. If I can get this.
Here, while you're dealing with that cat, okay, let me do the housekeeping real quick.
We're much better now. Why don't you let people know what they can do if they want to become a subscriber?
Yeah, so if you want to help make sure that Kevin can continue to feed Bogart and put a roof over Bogart's head, you can head on over to shadowproof.com/donate, chip in a couple dollars. Shadowproof, if you don't know already, is a 100% reader-funded publication. We don't have major donors. We don't have corporate sponsors, none of that garbage. All of our funding comes from people who give $5, $10, $15, $25. So if you appreciate the work that Kevin does, make sure that you go over to shadowproof.com/donate. And the last thing I wanted to say was just to make sure that you're following us on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook so that you can keep up to date with our show and with the wonderful reporting that we do. So that being said, Kevin, I know before we jump into our stories for the day that you came across something that you wanted to talk about in terms of what YouTube is doing with certain electoral content. Do you want to tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about this new policy that YouTube is rolling out, or I suppose Google. Google's the parent company for YouTube. And let's test the boundaries and limits of what free speech is allowed on this platform. So I'm going to talk about this new policy that they are apparently rolling out. And I'm going to read what the actual policy is that they have listed on the YouTube page. It says that they will now be removing content that contains hacked information, the disclosure of which may interfere with democratic processes such as elections and censuses. For example, videos that contain hacked information about a political candidate shared with the intent to interfere in an election. And so I immediately read that to understand that, while they want to protect us all from any sort of disinformation that might be, they seem to be conflating the two. There's a second thing that I'm not as alarmed by, though I don't really like giving big Silicon Valley tech companies this kind of control. But they do also mention that they would like to remove videos or plan to remove videos that are intent to obstruct or interrupt voting procedures. For example, telling viewers to create long voting lines with the purpose of making it harder for others to vote. So something like that, I don't see any purpose in necessarily allowing to have up. But on the other hand, I read this first part to directly target the Podesta emails, which were the Clinton campaign emails that were published in the 2016 election by WikiLeaks. And they were published by other media outlets as well. They were published by us. And if we were trying to do the show during 2016 and cover those materials, would we be accused of engaging in the aiding and abetting of an interference operation? I think that's obviously what would happen to us is YouTube would believe we were implicated in such an operation. And yet they are completely on the opposite side of the First Amendment. They are in contravention or they are displaying a kind of contempt for protections under the First Amendment. There was a case that was brought by the Democratic National Committee that was roundly rejected by Judge John Codall in the Southern District of New York. And this was an attempt to prosecute WikiLeaks for allegedly being involved in and working with the Russian Federation to publish these emails that did embarrass the Democrats and the Hillary Clinton campaign. But the judge in this lawsuit stood up for the First Amendment. He stood up for press freedom principles and said that the First Amendment prevents such liability in the same way it would preclude liability for press outlets that publish materials of public interest despite defects in the way the materials were obtained, so long as the disseminator did not participate in any wrongdoing in obtaining the materials in the first place. And since nobody is saying that WikiLeaks did the hack, or nobody is saying that WikiLeaks people did the leak, then they're allowed to publish this material. We're allowed to also share, disseminate, and discuss what it means for everybody politically. There's another thing that is worth saying as well from this that is important. Journalists are allowed to request documents that have been stolen and to publish those documents. That's what John Kodal said very definitively and clearly. Journalists are allowed to request documents that have been stolen and to publish those documents. And so we have a First Amendment right on this show, if there are hacked materials, to talk about them on this show. And then I ask a set of several questions about what Google is claiming the authority to do. What does Google even mean by quote unquote intent to interfere in an election? How do they determine intent? Who is helping them decide what intent people have? How are they? I mean, they've already labeled media state affiliated or state controlled, or they've already put labels on what that media is. So then I think it seems like it's more likely that those that have labels are the ones that are going to be hit for doing this kind of coverage of hacked or allegedly stolen material, which means we may not be as susceptible. But where does it stop? Is interfering, quote unquote, interfering, is that publicizing info that encourages dissent against a particular candidate? This is a very intense political moment that we have. There is a panic that is unfolding. We have an administration that is threatening to decimate the Postal Service in its entirety so that mail-in ballots cannot be delivered on time so that people can vote in the election, knowing full well that that may be one of the only ways Donald Trump can win in the election in November. So does that mean, with that as the backdrop, that if we dissent against Joe Biden and the policies of his political campaign, if we dissent against Kamala Harris, if somehow there's material that comes out from Joe Biden's campaign or something from Kamala Harris's past, if that was obtained through allegedly hacked, if those are allegedly hacked materials or if it's stolen materials, does that mean that we are going to be accused of interfering in the election? Does it instantly become interference if it's allegedly hacked or stolen materials, or is there any leeway for that? And what if this info comes from whistleblowers? How do we know what the agenda is of the people who have disseminated this material to us? We've been primed because of what happened in 2016 to believe that any of this material on this will be a negative thing for our democracy if we talk about it. But we don't know what these people are doing with this material necessarily. We don't know what kind of agendas they have. They might have partisan purposes, but even so, even if they do have partisan agendas, there may be some value that material has to us outside of their own partisan agenda. And it shouldn't be left up to YouTube or Google to determine what is and is not interference in an election, at least as vaguely as they have laid it out right now. So I think it's important to object. I really believe that, like a lot of others, I'm not alone in this, although there seem to be very few voices on the left who have made this an issue. But I really believe that President Donald Trump's administration has become a catalyst for a panic around the consumption of media and what we allow on our social media platforms. And over those past 4 years, we've given big tech companies great power to institute these policies and guidelines that basically give them a lot of control over what we're able to post and allow them to reconstitute and solidify their power over a lot of aspects of society. And the information that they're controlling, they have their own interests. They have their own DC-based think tanks that are advising them, because there is a certain status quo that they are trying to protect for themselves and at our expense.
Thank you, Kevin. That's a really important story, and I agree. I haven't seen enough of an issue made out of it, and I hope that we keep our eye on it on this show and at Shadowproof. So thank you very much for raising that. I want to move now into our stories for the week. The first story we have here involves bills granting federal whistleblowers access to courts would close major gap in protections. What's our first story?
So this is actually a good story, and I'm glad that this is happening. It has happened periodically over the last decade. You've seen in the House and the Senate, there have been efforts to grant federal whistleblowers an ability to go before the courts and get review from a jury, which is something that they don't have. In fact, you may not realize this, Brian, but since 2002, all private sector whistleblowers really have had an ability to go to our federal courts with their claims of retaliation and pursue some kind of a remedy, whether it is modest or small. And so this has not been available for federal whistleblowers. They've been told that they have to go through something called the Merit Systems Protection Board, which is a quasi-judicial administrative agency that exists in the U.S. government. And in fact, right now, it has no sitting members. It has a backlog of nearly 3,000 complaints that have piled up, and it is doing nothing to deal with whistleblower complaints. And all anybody can do is wait and wait and wait, because they really don't have much of an ability to move on to another venue and get some kind of validation of their claims. And we're talking about something called prohibited personnel practices, which is another way of saying retaliation. So this isn't exactly going to an inspector general with some kind of abuses of power and asking them to validate those concerns, or it's not really going to Congress with some information and saying we need that to be legitimized. What we're saying is people who have spoken up and then experienced retaliation have no means to seek compensation or damages right now because the MSPB is so dysfunctional. And we've got two bills that have been put forward. They have the full backing of a range of the leading whistleblower advocacy groups out there. That includes the National Whistleblower Center, which I spoke to their executive director over the past week. And it includes the Government Accountability Project and Public Citizen and the Project on Government Oversight, National Security Counselors. Some of these groups you've heard about before because we've referenced some of the reports and work that they do on whistleblowers. And so this is a huge deal. But back in 2012, when they had an opportunity to grant court access to federal whistleblowers, the National Whistleblower Center was working on this. They were raising concerns about the political nature of the MSPB, which we're seeing right now, because it's basically the panel is a political appointees, and you get two from the political party in charge, and then you get one from the party that is not in charge. And right now we have vacancies in a very polarized environment, and it's what the National Whistleblower Center warned about. And then in 2012, when Barack Obama was up for re-election, there was a lot going on that was unfolding with how the Senate and the House was deliberating over what the Whistleblower Enhancement Act was going to be that would expand the national whistleblower protections that existed. And they decided to remove any access to courts. And Barack Obama's White House essentially decided that they weren't going to fight for greater expansions. And so these groups were in a position where they were either going to oppose a rare opportunity to expand some whistleblower laws because it no longer had this in it, or they could take the little bits and pieces that were being given to them. And ultimately, they chose to take the little bits and pieces they were being given and come back later. And coming back later has meant 8 years later. And there's actually no guarantee that these bills will pass. But I I promote them in the positive right now because as they are drafted, and they're in two different bills. One's a Congressional Whistleblower Protection Act. The other's an amendment to the Whistleblower Protection Act. And in each cases, these are drawn up in ways that would be really useful for federal whistleblowing.
Thank you, Kevin. And, on that note, I want to remind people that, Shadowproof just celebrated its 5th birthday, but we actually have an archive that goes way, way back. I think it goes all the way back to like 2007 from our predecessor, Firedog Lake. I know that the issues of the MSPB were covered not only by you, Kevin, but by others at Shadowproof or at Firedog Lake at the time. So I just wanted to encourage people, it might be interesting if you find this story interesting and you want to dig in more, certainly go back through our archive and take a look. With that, I want to turn to our next story here. We have whistleblower retaliation against Black workers likely fueling the spread of COVID-19. Walk us through this story.
So there was a survey that was done, and I made this the exclusive story that we sent out with the Dissenter newsletter this past week. And so just to give a thumbnail summary of what this basically is about, there was a survey that was conducted that found essentially that Black workers in the United States are more than twice as likely as white workers to have experienced retaliation for raising health and safety concerns during the COVID-19 pandemic. And one connection they made that you don't see, and I think I could do a better job of making this connection in the stories that I've covered, because I had not made this connection in my coverage yet, which is that the impact that we're seeing from COVID-19 on Black communities, Latino communities, any marginalized or vulnerable communities that don't really have the ability to speak up in the workplace, that the greater exposure and the greater spread of COVID-19 that is happening is a result and can be connected to these repressive workplace environments. And I think that's an important point, is that not feeling like you have the ability to raise your voice and challenge the lack of safety means that you're being silent. You're trying to keep your job. We just did a comprehensive report that was published by Michael Sionnato over at Shadowproof, looking at the raging class warfare that is unfolding against poor and working class Americans, people who are struggling to obtain their unemployment insurance benefits. They're struggling to get personal protective equipment in their workplace that can protect them. They are going through so much, and those pressures, those external pressures that they are feeling, lead to silence and a feeling that you're just going to try and cope and survive, and you really don't want to raise your voice while you're in the workplace. And what happens is that makes everyone else there in the workplace more likely to be hurt and harmed, and it means it's more likely that we're going to see spread of the virus in our own communities outside those workplaces. It has an actual detrimental impact on all of us that these people are not able to come forward. And so this survey examined this dynamic that exists. It was done by the National Employment Law Project, which is a nonprofit that is directly concerned about expanding policies to protect unemployed and low-wage workers. And I think the survey, which they did a few months ago, touched on some very important issues. It also caught the attention of several prominent senators who wrote a letter to the U.S. Labor Department and in very stark and direct terms said that you need to step up and engage in enforcement actions to protect these workers because you haven't. And the occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, has let just like the MSPB kind of just let these whistleblower complaints pile up, and they haven't done anything to protect workers. And meanwhile, you've seen this class warfare unfolding. And a very clear example was Christian Smales in Staten Island. Amazon was a Black worker. He very early on in the pandemic in April raised his voice, challenged the lack of safety measures at that workplace, or a campaign for it to be shut down because Amazon was going to keep it open even as this outbreak continued in that facility. And he was retaliated against and fired. And eventually the Attorney General's office in New York validated his claims and said that they were concerned about how Amazon was treating potential whistleblowers like Christian Smalls. And so, I think that this is something that points to a dynamic that we really need to keep paying attention, because this has become the status quo right now. This is going to be the way things are from now until at least the end of this year, and it's going to keep having very detrimental effects on workers.
Thank you, Kevin. I want to turn next to Arizona, where police are abusing the Brady List to discredit whistleblowers. What the hell is going on in Arizona?
All right, so you probably know Brady Lists are kept to track dishonest cops and to ensure that prior misconduct is known within police agencies or even in the government. I presume that the prosecutors have access to these lists as well. Aren't they used, correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't they used to determine what cops would be called during trials so that you can prevent impeachment, because you want credible cops to get on the stand and not be attacked for their past misconduct. So that's helpful to prosecutors to try and bring the quote-unquote good cops, although I don't really believe that there are good cops and bad cops, but that's how prosecutors would describe them. In any case, in Arizona, this local ABC affiliate has been doing a series on the Brady Lists and the way they are abused, and this one points to a story that is right in our wheelhouse for the show, examining a case involving a man named Phil Roberts, who was an officer who was put on the Brady List after he challenged the city's false and wildly inflated statistics for cartel-style ransom kidnappings that were manufactured to obtain millions in federal grant funds. So essentially, they were saying that there were almost every day cartel-style kidnappings happening in Phoenix, and they needed these federal grant funds to fight them. But Roberts was part of the home invasion and kidnapping unit, and he knew that these were false statistics that were being put forward. And so he blew the whistle, challenged the city, and a scandal erupted that local news media covered. And eventually, he was put under internal investigation for raising his voice. And that internal investigation, as this ABC affiliate documents, led to allegations being sustained, which means that the city supposedly was able to validate these claims, although they're very bogus. So the first one was that, as ABC reports, that Roberts failed to follow the chain of command because he also sent his memorandums to other city leaders, like council members, so city council members. The second allegation was that Roberts made untruthful statements about fellow employees in his memos, which is something he denies. And the third allegation was that Roberts used city material for personal benefit or gain without permission. And then this, I'm not going to react with my own words. This is what ABC prints. Basically, in that final allegation, he was sustained for using the City of Phoenix bird symbol at the top of his memos and calling into the records department to get information from incident reports to support his claims. So Roberts said, because I wrote memorandums with the bird on it, I was using city resources for personal gain. Ludicrous. And essentially, he was fired for whistleblowing. Roberts sued, and eventually he got a settlement. And he even says he had a heart attack from all the stress. Then he got his job back. But when he got his job back, he was notified that he was now on the Brady List. And he immediately said, I want off of this Brady List. And the reply was, sorry, we can't do that. It's really being done. So he was put on this Brady List of dishonest cops. And eventually he kind of got forced into retirement, or he took on a kind of like honorable retirement, and he left. And so he's no longer a cop. But, this is, I think this points to something that I had not considered, which is another mechanism that departments would have in order to enforce that code of silence, in order to create that blue wall and intimidate cops. And we see throughout decades of history the kind of intimidation and harassment from anyone who, we can sit here and say, oh, what did you think the cops were doing? You became an officer. This is what they do all the time. But, there are people who go in, they don't realize what they're being asked to do. This happens in the U.S. military as well. And then they start to wake up and they want to exercise their conscience, and they believe that they can do so on the job. And what happens? The sledgehammer comes down quite dramatically. And this is one way, maybe more sophisticated and more subtle way that they can control police officers, because who wants to end up on the Brady list? I mean, I think that would probably be something that could be referenced to in, when they're handing out promotions, or it's not a good thing to be on the Brady list.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's keep an eye on that story for sure. That's very interesting. Our last story that we have on here is the New Jersey National Guard, a member of which blew the whistle on a lack of COVID-19 safety. What is happening in New Jersey?
So we've been covering these stories of people in workplaces who have their concerns of safety and the lack of precautions shot down. They're told to go away. This source, who remains anonymous, a National Guard member in New Jersey, in the Army National Guard, spoke to a local radio station in New Jersey, 101.5, and mentioned that he came forward because he cares about soldiers, for them to be put at risk and their families at risk, especially at a time when there's no mission. It seems so needless. And so there were these photos that went around of these National Guard members sitting in a mess hall close to each other. The governor was upset to see these photos, but then also this source provides some information about the disdain that is existent towards having any kind of proper precautions. He points out that the soldiers are being made responsible for supplying their own personal protective equipment. He says that even though the Defense Department guidance says that face coverings should be washed regularly, many soldiers are re-wearing their filthy face coverings, according to this radio station. So, and he goes on, he or she goes on, no soldier is really local to here. If you're a soldier here, you probably come from throughout the state. And then you have 100 people coming from every county in the state congregating and then releasing them back home to their parents and other loved ones. We also have some older soldiers. My concern was they were going to potentially infect each other and then spread it statewide. There's an example here of when they confronted higher ranking officials, but this whistleblower says they seem to act like the whole thing is a hoax because their actions do not back up their stated concerns for safety. So they basically diminish the threat and do not believe that they need to do much of anything. There are soldiers who have been worried about contracting the virus. They've had to seek and pay for their own testing. That has not been provided by the National Guard, according to this whistleblower. And the soldiers who did not want to share sleeping tents during a 3-night field training exercise at Fort Dix, where there was a single hand washing station for about 100 people that was inoperable. They had to purchase tents at their own expense. So it seems like at every juncture, the safety is a cost that you have to take on. And I don't think we can divorce this from the larger picture in the United States. Everywhere, whether it's in a government institution or a corporate institution, we are seeing this where it is, and these are working class people primarily who take this work and decide to sign up for the National Guard usually. So these working class people forced to take on the cost of protecting them from COVID-19. That's the consistent thread through almost all of these stories.
Thank you, Kevin. Those are all of our stories for today, but I know that you wanted to provide your usual update on what is going on with the case of Julian Assange and his extradition hearings. What is the latest with Julian?
We know that recently Bill Barr, who is the Attorney General of the Justice Department, has signed a superseding indictment. We covered this indictment several weeks ago. It has no additional charges. It's the same 18 charges that Julian Assange has faced. To refresh your memory, we are talking about 17 charges of allegedly violating the Espionage Act. And then there's the one charge that makes it look like he was involved in hacking and that he engaged in a conspiracy to commit a computer crime. And so they added and expanded the scope of this indictment. And until now, they had not delivered it to the magistrate court so that the judge could have it. There is a September hearing that is scheduled and still on the calendar for September that would start on September 7th. And there's a lot up in the air right now. A case management hearing will be taking place on August 14th, Friday. And then if the hearing is not moved, that major hearing will take place. That's a crucial hearing for Julian Assange and his legal team, where they're going to call witnesses, put forward evidence in order to challenge the case that the U.S. may have for extradition. It's on them. They have to prove to the judge that Julian Assange should not be extradited to the United States. This is a judge who's largely a rubber stamp when it comes to extradition cases. At least that's her record and the reputation that she has. So what we're looking at here then is they need to put as much evidence as they can so that they'll have that after when they go to an appeals court, and then they can suggest that the judge ignored certain details or certain pieces of evidence that needed to be paid attention. And then that might help them win in one of the appellate courts. But this is something we know is going to take the next 4 to 5 years of Julian Assange's life, potentially. And we have this pandemic as a backdrop, and so do I, personally speaking. I don't know what I'm going to be doing. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to be and how I plan to cover this hearing if it does take place. But there's one thing that you can say very clearly about what is happening with the Trump administration. The fact that they took so long to give notice of the superseding indictment, the fact that they may be using this indictment to push the hearing and get it rescheduled, maybe until after the election in November. We don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what their interest is and why they would feel it would conflict with the election, but it's 3 weeks and it could contribute to a lot of negative press against the Trump administration if this hearing is taking place in the UK in September. And so that may be something they don't want to take a chance on, because they're already seeing very, very bad polls against Joe Biden. And also, as we said at the top of the show, they're trying to decimate the U.S. Postal Service so that they can win through voter suppression. So all I can say is it's clear that this represents a flagrant abuse of due process rights. It's an abuse of process as well. And that alone should be reason to dismiss the case. If Judge Vanessa Bretzer was worth anything, had any decency, she would look at what the Trump administration was doing through the U.S. Justice Department and decide that this was improper the way it has been brought, and order Julian Assange to be freed from the Belmarsh maximum security prison right now. I do not expect that to happen, but I'm just saying, claims of upholding human rights, caring about the rule of law and legal principles, this is an abuse of process to issue a superseding indictment and then sign it right before a case management hearing, to blindside the defense in this way. The legal team says that Julian Assange has not had access to his attorneys for 5 months. There's absolutely no way we can expect that in September, Julian Assange will be able to participate, follow, engage in the hearing that is going to unfold, and understand what is happening in the courtroom as well, with all of these defense witnesses that are supposed to be called to give evidence with all of the information and anything else that might be in exhibits that would be introduced into the extradition case. I'm not exactly familiar with the process, but I think primarily the way that they're going to get new information in there would be through witness testimony, but there might be other statements that get introduced into the record if it runs anything like a trial hearing. And I don't see how Julian Assange could appropriately understand what's happening, given the fact that he's been obstructed from communicating with his attorneys, and largely with the backdrop of the pandemic, and believing that if he is meeting with his attorneys and if he's moved around too much, that he would be vulnerable to contracting the virus. And again, this has been the case because his request for bail was denied very early during the pandemic, and he was not allowed to go live in home confinement. And so that raises the stakes. That makes it so this September hearing has to happen, and he can't really be patient. He doesn't want to wait until 2021. His team doesn't want to wait until 2021 to have a hearing. They want to have it now because he is sitting in a jail cell in Belmarsh's maximum security prison in London.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that's it for our show this week. Do you any final words, anything you want to leave people with, or is that it?
Sometimes on the show, we talk about what's happening politically, so we can just make a general note of potential whistleblowers out there who we should show solidarity with as they come forward. And I think right now, as you are looking at coverage of what's happening with the U.S. Postal Service, it's very easy to feel powerless. I saw that I think it was John Ben Menachem who said something about feeling like there's not a lot you can do because, if police are committing abuses in the streets, you can go out and protest and you can challenge the way they're trying to control your community. But what are we supposed to do with the Postal Service was his point. He said something to the effect of, so far we've only been told we can buy stamps. And then I've seen people who have solidarity with incarcerated individuals say, well, buy stamps and then write prison letters, and then you can do two things that are really useful. And we don't really have a good way to protect the Postal Service from the decimation that it seems to be experiencing. I suppose we could have solidarity rallies outside of Postal Service locations and say that we've got Postal Service workers' backs during this hard time. It'd be one of those rare examples of people actually showing up to federal government buildings and not protesting the people inside them. But I think we need to read closely the coverage that is coming out on this matter, look between the lines, see that there are probably sources who are taking substantial risk on at this moment, risking their careers, risking their status in the Postal Service, risking their families. They could lose their jobs and not know how they're going to put food on the table, what they're going to do to put their kids through school, and all sorts of other things that are important bread and butter issues that we see both political parties never give a whole lot of attention to unless there's a crisis. And if you see those, amplify what those people are saying, recognize that those are whistleblowers, know that they don't really have many avenues or ways that they can come forward and say what they have to say. Their identities deserve to be known, but unfortunately, we're living in a society where it's too dangerous for us to know who they are. So they may save us from something really awful happening in the next few months. And we may not know who these people are who save us from this predicament that could have befallen us. But if they do protect us, if they do make sure that all these mail-in ballots get to where they need to be in November, then they'll be heroes, because it does definitely seem like there is something being done right now. And it doesn't just involve presidential candidates. Let's be clear. Mail-in ballots are going to include congressional candidates. They would include people at the county and the state level that people are voting on. So it could upend a whole lot of elections, all up and down the different levels of government. It could have quite an impact. And I think we need to stand up for those people who are willing to talk to journalists or maybe even decide that they want to speak out on their own on their Twitter accounts or Facebook pages, or go anonymously on Reddit pages and say what they have to say. If they're found out, and there are ways that government agencies can detect who these people are that are posting, if they are found out, there will be repercussions, and we will need to have their backs and show solidarity.
Thank you, Kevin. I think we will leave it there. I just wanted to remind folks that are watching, and first of all, thank you for watching and for your comments and for sharing the show. That means a lot to us, and it helps other people find about our work. I just wanted to encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And if you appreciate the show, if you appreciate the reporting that we're doing, please go to shadowproof.com/donate. Chip in a few dollars. It's how we pay our writers to do the show. It's how we keep the website running. So any little bit that you could chip in helps. With that being said, Kevin, I will talk to you probably sooner than Thursday, but we will talk with everybody a week from now. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your week.